G'day, I'm Alistair, and in this video we are going to be testing out sugar. So we are continuing our series on distillation, and we're going to make a wash from 3 different kinds of sugar, so 3 different washes, from dextrose, regular table sugar, and invert sugar. So we're going to be inverting the sugar, table sugar, and seeing if that improves the quality of the wash or quality of the final alcohol. So we'll start by sanitizing everything, and really what we want to know is it worth spending the extra money on dextrose, because it costs about twice as much as table sugar per kilogram, and you have to use slightly more of it, so sort of 15% more or so to get the same level of specific gravity. It does dissolve a lot more easily though, so it does have that advantage. So yep, as I said, we'll start by sanitizing everything, and then we'll probably make the invert sugar because it's going to take a while. It's going to take about half an hour of boiling of the sugar with some acid and getting up to boil and stuff. So I think we need about quite a few kilograms of 7 kilograms or something like that of sugar, but more than that, because we are going to attempt to make 30 litre batches of the wash. And so yeah, let's get on to that. I will first check that I do indeed have enough dextrose for that. So maybe I'll measure that out first. So anyway, let's get into it. And it's going to take a while because the fermentation is going to take probably a couple of weeks for that to ferment fully. Maybe less, it could be as little as a week, but it just depends on conditions. So let's get into it. The first thing I want to do is give everything a quick wash. It's been sitting in storage for a while and gathered a bit of dust, not to mention a few dead bugs. We will start by sanitizing the fermenters. I'm using a Starsan clone, which is basically the same ingredients, but much cheaper. It's a blend of phosphoric acid and dodecyl benzene sulfonic acid, and is designed to eliminate bacteria and wild yeast on contact, with a typical contact time of about 1 to 2 minutes. It's heavily diluted, about 1 part in 700 or so. What I'm spraying is a bit more concentrated as I'm spraying it on, rather than soaking everything in solution. You want to make sure that after you spray something, you give it a couple of minutes to do its magic. I've seen many people spray their equipment and use it immediately, which is not enough time for the equipment to be sanitized. Starsan is a no-rinse sanitizer. You can spray it on, let it contact for the required time, and then use your equipment. The foam left behind won't harm your fermentation, although I tend to give things a rinse with boiling water. It's effective against bacteria, wild yeast and mould, and works by lowering the pH to levels that kill microorganisms. Starsan is safe on all typical brewing and distilling equipment. You'll be using stainless steel, glass, food-grade plastics and silicone, all perfectly fine. This covers your fermenters, kettles, bottles, hoses, gaskets and kegs. You can spray it on, let it do its job, and not worry about any damage or corrosion to these materials. However, you need to avoid using Starsan on soft metals like aluminium and copper and brass, because Starsan is acidic. It will etch and corrode these materials. Aluminium is particularly susceptible to pitting and discoloration. If you have an aluminium brew kettle or copper immersion chiller or something like that, just use a different kind of sanitizer, and maybe just stick with heat sanitization. Avoid using it on natural stone surfaces, chrome-plated items with prolonged contact, and obviously wood, since it's porous and can't really be sanitized anyway. For most home brewers though, if you're using modern stainless and plastic equipment, Starsan is completely safe and you don't need to worry about it. I'm grabbing my bucket of dextrose. We want to measure out about 9 kilos into our fermenter. I often purchase dextrose in 25 kilo bags. Dextrose is very hygroscopic, meaning that it wants to absorb moisture out of the atmosphere, so once the bag is opened, I'll transfer it into sealed containers. Dextrose is commercially produced by breaking down starch, typically from corn, which is why it's often called corn sugar. This process involves taking cornstarch, which is a long chain of glucose molecules bonded together, and breaking those bonds to release individual glucose molecules. This can be done either through acid hydrolysis, where the starch is treated with dilute acid and heat, or more commonly today through enzymatic hydrolysis using enzymes like alpha amylase and glucoamylase. The enzymatic method is preferred because it's more controlled, produces higher purity glucose, and is more efficient. I'm going to be doing a few things in parallel to save time. The thing that's going to take the most time is producing the invert sugar. So I'm going to fill this pot about halfway with water and get it boiling. With that out of the way, we can get back to measuring out our dextrose. While you watch me measure out the dextrose in 1 kilogram batches, a pastime marginally more exciting than watching paint dry, I'll discuss how it's made, which starts with cornstarch being mixed with water to create a slurry. Enzymes are then added to break the long starch chains into shorter ones, and finally into individual glucose molecules. Once you have the glucose solution, it undergoes filtration and purification to remove impurities, proteins, and residual materials. The purified glucose solution is then concentrated and crystallized to produce the white crystalline dextrose powder you buy in stores. The final product is dried and packaged. This is essentially the opposite of what plants do. They take individual glucose molecules and chain them together to make starch for energy storage, and we're breaking those chains back down into individual sugars. It's a pretty energy-intensive industrial process, which is part of why dextrose costs more than just refined sugarcane as table sugar. Now, here's a slight point of confusion. Glucose and dextrose are the exact same molecule. They are just different names for the same thing. Glucose is the more sciencey name, and dextrose refers to the white powdered form you can buy from a store. It's more of a commercial name. So you might speak of a bag of dextrose, but you wouldn't measure the dextrose levels in your blood. You would use glucose in that instance. Just to slip in another fact, the glucose molecule has the chemical formula C6H12O6, meaning it has 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms, specifically arranged. When you buy a bag of dextrose, you're likely getting dextrose monohydrate. In this form, the sugar's crystalline structure actually traps a water molecule inside it, meaning about 9% of that weight is just water. To get 100% sugar, you need the anhydrous form, but be warned, anhydrous dextrose is extremely hygroscopic. It's so thirsty for moisture that if you leave it exposed to the air, it will likely suck up the humidity and literally turn into a solid brick of monohydrate. As you can probably see, the dextrose is a powder rather than the larger crystals that is normally associated with table sugar. I had almost exactly 8 kilograms of dextrose in my bucket, and to make up the difference I had purchased an additional 1 kilo bag just in case, and by fluke it was the exact amount I needed. Let's now get this dextrose dissolved. I'm using boiling water because it dissolves the sugar more easily, and I want the final temperature to be about 30 degrees Celsius, which won't be reached with tap water. While I'm waiting for the kettle to boil, I can start adding sugar to my pot of not quite yet boiling water. Be aware we are adding lots of sugar, so it will increase the volume in the pot by quite a bit. So you don't want to be starting with a pot full of water. I'm going to be adding 7.8 kilograms of sugar. From the instructions for a standard 23 litre wash, it would be 6 kilograms of sugar, but we are making 30 litres. So 6 divided by 23 gives us about 260 grams of sugar per litre. Multiply that by the 30 litres we want, and that gives us just over 7.8 kilograms. Now, the goal of our stovetop chemistry experiment is to create invert sugar. Invert sugar is what you get when you break down sucrose, which is our table sugar, into its two component simple sugars, glucose and fructose. Regular table sugar is a disaccharide, a molecule made up of one glucose and one fructose molecule bonded together. When you invert it, you're splitting that bond through a process called hydrolysis, which adds a water molecule and separates the two sugars. The term invert comes from the fact that the process reverses the rotation of polarized light passing through the solution. Sucrose rotates light to the right, but the resulting glucose-fructose mixture rotates it to the left, hence inverted. We are making invert sugar by heating a sugar solution with a small amount of acid, in our case citric acid, but cream of tartar is also an option. The acid and heat catalyze the hydrolysis reaction, breaking those sucrose bonds. I'm going to use about 1 gram of citric acid per kilogram of sugar, but you can go up to 5 grams if you want to be very aggressive, so a range of about 8 to 40 grams would work for this recipe. We will want to heat our solution to 70 to 80 degrees for 20 to 30 minutes. I'm just going to let it boil and simmer it for that duration. In theory, you can tell it's working because the solution will become slightly clearer and sweeter tasting than the original sugar water, but I find it impossible to tell without a reference point. Here I'm measuring out the citric acid. In hindsight, I should have been more generous, but it all worked out in the end. I call this my Schedule 1 scale, as I seem to mostly use it for accurately measuring out white powders, although sometimes it does get used to measure out yeast. While I remembered to add the citric acid to the sugar solution, I forgot to video it, so you'll just have to trust me on that. After that digression into invert sugar, we are now back to dissolving the dextrose. Dextrose dissolves noticeably faster than sugar in water, which is one of its practical advantages. Being a monosaccharide with a simpler molecular structure, it breaks down more readily. You'll find that stirring a dextrose solution gets you to complete dissolution quicker than the same amount with table sugar. Dextrose solubility increases dramatically with temperature. At 20 degrees, which is probably warmer than the tap water temperature, you can dissolve about 900 to 950 grams of dextrose per litre. At 50 degrees Celsius, that jumps to around 2.4 kilograms per litre. That's nearly triple, and the hot water we're using is a lot hotter than 50 degrees. Dissolving dextrose is an endothermic reaction, that is, the solution will cool a bit as it dissolves. You can test this yourself by tasting a teaspoon of dextrose. You will notice the cooling effect on your tongue. We are using the recipe on the back of the turbo yeast packet, which calls for about 15% more dextrose by weight than table sugar. You'll get about 5% more ethanol per gram from sugar than dextrose, and these facts give us two things to keep in mind. Firstly, the specific gravity of our dextrose wash is going to be higher than the sugar. Secondly, we should get about 10% higher alcohol yield from the dextrose wash, basically 15% more weight minus the 5% lower yield per unit of weight. The dextrose is starting to dissolve. It's still quite cloudy, so I'll continue to add boiling water until it's clear. We are back to checking our invert sugar. All the sugar has dissolved, and I'm just giving it a good stir. I want to make sure the temperature is evenly distributed, so when I take a temperature reading, it's a bit more accurate. And we're about halfway to boiling, so I'm going to place the lid on top to improve the efficiency. I think the dextrose is now sufficiently dissolved, so I'm going to start adding cold water. Technically, tap water is not sanitized, and we could be introducing undesirable yeast and bacteria, but I think the concentrations are so low and the turbo yeast is so aggressive that it's not going to be a problem. And the turbo yeast is going to far outcompete anything else. And I'm adding the final amount of water to take us up to the 30-litre mark. And a final check to confirm we have 30 litres and stir out the remaining cloudiness. As you can see, my handwriting is the envy of serial killers the world over. Make sure you label everything before things get confused. And we are on to measuring out the sugar for our third wash, which is just the plain table sugar. This is going to be the same 7.8 kilos we are using for our invert sugar wash. Making this wash is the same level of complexity as our dextrose wash, however it's somewhat cheaper because of the lower price of the sugar. And again, we're using boiling water rather than cold to make it easier to dissolve the sugar. Our invert sugar is finally up to temperature, and as you can see, you shouldn't rely on a temperature gun for accurate readings as they need to be calibrated for different surfaces. I'm setting a timer for 30 minutes, which should be plenty of time to break our sucrose into fructose and glucose. We can now finish up getting the sugar dissolved, for which we'll add more hot water and mix while we're waiting for the kettle to boil. You can see the sugar solution is fairly clear, although it has a slight yellow colour. This might be because of some caramelization occurring from the boiling water. And I'm just going to top up the solution with cold tap water. Again, we're aiming for 30 litres in total. And a bit of slow-mo of me mixing some oxygen into the wash. This extra oxygen is important to get our yeast started. And remember to label. I've been working on this for quite some time now, and it's time for some lunch. Nothing like a microwaved pie for sustenance. But not for long, as we can go back to working on the invert sugar, as it's had half an hour of boiling now. I'm just going to adjust everything so that I can get the bucket as close to the pot as I can to minimize spillage. And now it's just a matter of transferring our invert sugar solution. Be very careful as it's boiling hot and the sugar makes it sticky and easy to burn skin. Now that the pot is light enough, I can just pour the remainder directly. I'm just going to carry the bucket before it's much heavier after filling it with the remaining cold water. Again, I want to mix in some oxygen to help with fermentation. Houston, we have a problem. 45 degrees Celsius is too hot to be able to add the yeast. It would be even too hot for a bath. I could just wait for the solution to cool naturally, but it would likely take 6 hours or more. And as I'm on a timeline, I'm going to take a shortcut by adding some ice bricks. I'm first going to sanitize them before adding them to the sugar wash. I want to prepare the turbocarbon by heating it in some hot water. This will soften it quite a bit. Time to take measurements. We will start by taking temperature readings, as measurements with the hydrometer are affected by temperature, and we can calculate back to the correct values. I'm giving the hydrometer a spin, as this will remove any bubbles sticking to it, which could give us bad readings. I'm mainly interested in the specific gravity reading for our dextrose. This looks to be 1.102 at 27 degrees Celsius. We're going to repeat the process for our regular sugar wash. Its gravity should be slightly lower than the dextrose due to the fact that it has less solids dissolved in it, 7.8 kilograms versus 9 kilograms of dextrose. And again, we want to take note of the temperature so we can calibrate our readings. And the specific gravity for our sugar wash looks to be 1.092. Let's pull out these ice bricks. This is the second batch I've used to bring the temperature down. Annoyingly, there seems to be some bits of label that have come off. Let's transfer the hydrometer and take a temperature reading. I had been mixing the wash to get it to cool faster, so I think the temperature should be evenly spread throughout the wash. And it looks like our specific gravity is exactly 1.1. Time to add the turbocarbon. It's a form of activated carbon, a fancy name for charcoal. However, it's specifically sized and prepared for use during fermentation. The carbon adsorbs congeners, fusel oils, and other undesirable compounds as they are being produced during fermentation. The idea is that removing them in real time prevents them from participating in further chemical reactions that can compound off flavors. Still Spirits claim this is more effective than post-fermentation carbon treatment, which I'll also be doing. Activated carbon is effective because of its enormous surface area. A single gram can have 500 to 1500 square meters of surface area due to its porous structure. It works by adsorption, not absorption. Compounds bind to its surface electrostatically. To get the turbocarbon out of its packet, you'll need to heat it, which we have already done, then massage it. You can feel it transitioning from something quite solid into a slurry. The same process is unfortunately great at damaging the label on the packet, so be careful not to add this to your wash at the same time as the carbon. Then cut a corner and pour and squeeze it out. Now that I've added the carbon to each wash, I'm going to do the same for the turbo yeast. Nothing complex here. Cut open the packet and pour it in. Turbo yeast is an all-in-one technology designed specifically for home distilling. While traditional yeast rely on the nutrients found naturally in fruit or grain, turbo yeast is specifically designed for sugar washes which contain almost zero nutrients for the yeast to survive. The packet contains not just yeast, which is highly aggressive and alcohol tolerant, but also complex nutrients such as nitrogen, vitamins, and minerals that the yeast will consume to stay healthy while eating pure sugar. pH buffers are also present to prevent the wash from becoming too acidic, which would normally stall the fermentation. Some varieties contain additional mineral adsorbents that help soak up impurities during the fermentation itself. Standard bread or wine yeast usually taps out around 8 to 12% alcohol. If you try to force them any higher, they get stressed and produce sulfur or rotten egg smells. Finally, time to seal everything up and fit airlocks. The airlock will allow carbon dioxide to escape, but prevent oxygen from getting back in. Oxygen can cause the yeast to stop producing alcohol and start producing other compounds. If acetobacter is present, this might start turning your alcohol into vinegar. Letting the carbon dioxide out is important as, well, explosions are bad. Yeah, busy game. Meow. What's that? You picked up? No, don't say that. You'll get me demonetized. Right, I'll pick you up. Is it a bit crazy talking to a cat? Only if they talk back. Oh, okay. That's fine then. That's better, isn't it? After only an hour, the fermentation has started already. We are now into the next morning and everything is fermenting fine. At this stage there is no clear winner. They all seem to start fermenting at about the same time. I'm going to finish part 1 here. In part 2 we will clear our washes and then distill them. Preparing this video has been a rather epic endeavour. Remember to like and subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments, especially if you have any hints or tips that you would like to share, and give your guess as to what is going to be the best sugar.